Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining me. I have a couple avian friends here with me in the garden. And my friends are vulnerable to hawks. I noticed there were some near, and they're usually really good about noticing them. But the scope of their concern is not the same as the scope of mine. And the way they're in the world, I think, is wildly different from the way that I am, while at the same time sharing features that are similar. I think their sense of being embodied and being in time is very different from mine. Although, if I were to be able to allow my thinking aspects to settle down, something quite extraordinary might emerge as my experience. Something wildly unlike my common expectation and thought. And of course I suspect this from experience. Having had some experiences like this, where either the tenor of my thinking mind changes, and we all know what that's like, right? The difference between worrying about a problem or being excited about an experience or adventure, the difference between washing the dishes and driving the car, the difference between when we're emerging moment to moment in deep relationship with someone. We might be laughing or playing or working on something together. And when we're just clicking through Instagram posts or Twitter posts. Kind of funny how the humans name technologies after animals. I suspect that there's more meaningful content somehow in the chirping of a single hummingbird than there is in all of Twitter. But of course there are different kinds of meaning. And this is where things get strange with language. Because we have words that we suppose to refer, somehow the supposition is, it's not necessarily natural, it's taught to us. And we can unlearn it. But we have words that we think refer to the same thing, like meaning, or love, or even counting. And yet, I guess part of the illusion here is just that words have senses in the dictionary. And we suppose that the senses are sufficient and complete, or something. And also that two things named, it seems naturally to be expected that two things named the same thing are reasonably dealt with in thought as the same thing. Yet, of course, this is never so. Well, it's actually not never so. There are unique ways where we have made it so by how we use terms. For example, the number one is an idea. But it could also be a mark on a page or some bits in a machine. But there's a way in which we can abstract numerical qualities so that one here and one there are understood to refer to the same thing. But at how deep does that similarity go? Because unless those ones are appearing in the same mind at the same time, simultaneously, they certainly can't be the same thing. So while it's not unreasonable for us to treat them as the same, for various purposes that we're interested in, fundamentally, if there are two ones that are the same, I cannot find them. I heard a couple talking earlier, and the man was saying, "We have a bunch of these at home." And the woman said, "Yes, but they're not the same ones." And it startled me for a moment. In a way, both of their expressions are reasonable. Yet we can see in how they form and express themselves that their concerns are different. And when their concerns are different, what is beheld is different. And this is one of the truly astonishing things about being able to think representationally. There are all, much like our own humanity, there are hidden assets in our common relationships with language, also hidden dangers. The capacity to think in language and concepts, to do accounting, to compare, to evaluate. All of these representational behaviors have traditional forms in our actual human experience. And many of these traditional forms are so crude as to act primarily as impediments to intelligence while pretending that something else is going on. It's easy to collapse the unknown and the diversely unique nature of experience and relation, what we refer to as reality. It's a little too easy to collapse it into casual language and think we've encompassed it and somehow captured it. But mostly what we're capturing here is kind of our own tale. And I mean that both in the sense that animals have tails, and also in the sense of story. Because our languages are emergent from the histories of humanity and life on Earth, both. If I say you have a tree, you imagine something, perhaps, or perhaps you don't actually imagine anything visible. You consider or reflect, or if you're wanting to, you will bring into consciousness some things about trees in general, or a generalized tree, or something like this. And essentially what's happening is we're having an idea that relates to kind of category theoretical, set theoretical framework. Trees have these properties, they look approximately like this: roots, branches, trunk, some stuff on the branches, maybe fruit, maybe leaves, maybe needles, maybe the branches are bare. But even if I say, think of a tree, and I do this twice with you, we do it together, will the second one be the same as the first one? Will our concerns color what our imaginations produce when we hear the word tree, or what we do with our minds when we're in conversation or reflecting, questing, searching, trying to learn? Perhaps the man meant, we have many plants like this at home. Perhaps the woman meant, they are not the same variety. But in order to derive those interpretations, I have to have concerns of some kind. Right? And those concerns will color my interpretations. And so it is with every movement of our minds. Our concerns or purposes, our skin in the game, the way we're in the world, our history, what we've been doing over the past few minutes, the context that we're immersed in our homes, cars, offices, in the wild. All of these will color our interpretations. And unfortunately, in the context of the inside of a box, looking at a screen, computer, our context is manipulated by our responses to the past few previous cycles of stimuli. Very deeply related to these things. So that we will interpret a text we read very differently if something comes before it that enchants us, or if something comes before it that upsets us or angers us. The next thing we read will inherit some of the qualities of tone, intention, concern that were previously present in our awareness or our body and our bodies, because our bodies change when we have emotions. It's not all cerebral. In fact, very little of it is cerebral, and I strongly suspect that things going on in our bodies have much more to do with what we think and feel than we might ordinarily imagine. A lot more. I suspect that cellular metabolism affects things like mood and orientation, even concern. When I heard the man and the woman speaking, and they were just very casually chatting, I happened to overhear them. I thought it might be interesting to explore the idea of what does one mean? How do you get from everything to something? And one of the things that's important here is that there are different domains in which we will become concerned about one and what it is, what it does. And so value is a many-petaled flower, and so too is number. It's not much like the simple way we usually think about it, and partly we're inventing it. Though that's a complex discussion. And of course, I don't expect to succeed in my interest in learning about one together today. The topic's conceivably infinite. In fact, perhaps most topics are infinite. And this is part of why we want to snip off the infinity in various different kinds of ways. Or not just the infinity, the array of infinities that emerge once one begins to distinguish anything at all. We want to snip those off and have a convenient tag for the remains. A tree. And though we know what I mean when I use the word tree, it doesn't really have anything to do much with any actual tree. In fact, it's kind of a way of throwing away the infinities, producing a token that we can manipulate in various ways, some of them usefully purposeful, some of them very dangerously confused. But this whole idea of one, what is one, lies at the basis of of all of our urges, fears, desires, right? One case of cancer is very different from one winning lottery ticket, which is very different from spending an hour with someone you adore, together, who adores you. So are all different kinds of ones, but they're not very similar. And part of how we get to one is by throwing away infinities. We narrow the scope. But there are ways of narrowing the scope that largely evict lived experience, embodied relation, and produce a layer that's very abstract, useful and apparently effective in thinking. He apparently has a asterisk on it. Not muchly related to the complexities it pretends to dissect for us. I think the idea of classes is at once really, or categories, it's really useful, and it's also, it can be very confusing if we're not able to educate ourselves very carefully about it. Because if I use the word tree, really what I'm pointing at there is a class or a set. And we also have things that word refers to that aren't like the living being that we call a tree, or the expression of life on earth that we call a tree. Hi. Or the expression of the nature and character of time-space that we call a tree. Here you can see in those three examples very different ways of thinking about what is a tree being. And perhaps each tree is being tree-ish in ways it shares with other trees. But it's certainly being tree-ish in ways no other tree can share. Unless the trees are somewhat like a living network that the beings who dwell therein can travel in which case they could be different trees. Sounds fantastical, perhaps. Most of what I've come to understand about nature is more than any fantastical thing we can invent. It's truly staggeringly unexpected, rich, diverse, infinite, profound, alive, sensitive, beautiful, adoring, astonishing. the onset of our capacity to form the idea of one something, a separate, specific, possibly concrete, possibly continuously present thing. Right now I'm looking at a street cone. And it seems to be continuously present. And frankly, out here in the wild part of the garden, it's really out of place. It really looks distinct. But it's a very peculiar one. It's old, and much of the dye has worn off, and the top is cracked and broken. And it's a thing of rubber. It's an artifact made by humans. And they're really good at producing ones like this. We have machines that make endless ones. Endless packets of ketchup. Endless light bulbs, endless shoelaces. Endless little plastic containers for endless substances. Some of them terribly poisonous. Others perhaps intoxicating. Our species seems to be very interested in the production of these artifacts. Perhaps more interested in that than anything else, at least at the orders where we are collectives, where we participate in collectives. That problem has a history and a structure we can meaningfully examine and learn to understand. But it's not my intention to wander in that direction at the moment. I'm much more interested in one, and the astonishing difference between the capacity that might emerge first in our cognitive development to distinguish one, to understand that is one something, or this one is the one I love. How shocking a development it must be to go from that to two. The entire universe of possibility changes forever, because with two you can have harmony, you can have polarity, you can have qualities of the second thing that transform the nature of the first thing, and back and forth. All of these astonishing possibilities emerge to the minds with which we think. And of course, many of these things I'm talking about have nonverbal aspects. There's a kind of, how to put this, I often think about, different layers of a situation to help me organize my thought, and to keep me from collapsing it to, one thing. Oh, it's just this, right? It's just that, blah, blah. That move tends to be an abandonment of any kind of concern about learning. Oh, it's just a blah, blah, blah. Yeah. That's one of the ultimate de-infinitizing moves. There are no infinities associated with that. It's just a this, right? And we can be done with it. And weirdly, that's one of the concerns that underlies the peculiar development of our cognitive inheritance, our representational inheritance, is the concern to be done with having to concern yourself with something, right? If I can classify things in such a way that maps relatively well to threats and opportunities, then I don't have to remain hypervigilant at all moments, the way some of the small birds in the garden are. Although they too have rest. They too settle down. Fluff up. Hang out with a friend. They're brilliant, the little birds. The field is so broad in my concern about or interest in one, that I'm not really sure precisely where to go. I think one of the things that's easily lost as we become habituated to language and human culture, common thought and speech, is we may be inclined to forget that thinking and speaking are intentional acts. And if our intentions are different, they produce different results. Because effectively, it isn't as though we have a mind. We don't have one mind. And it's not even clear that we have anything at all. Many other perspectives are also at least likely, if not probable, one of them being we participate. You can immediately see that if we weren't participating with many minds, we would not acquire or invent language, right? And so all of these concerns would not be going on. We would not be having this discussion. I wouldn't be curious about one. I'm not sure how it would be, but it wouldn't be like this. We learn and form habits and then practice them, and I think too many of them are habits of desperation from the loneliness that is, for so many of us, profoundly a part of our modern experience. And in isolation, our intentions change and are more easily manipulated from without having to name what kinds of constructs want to manipulate it and why. But all around there are motives, interpretations, evaluations, a kind of, honestly, terrifying plethora of accounting games and courtroom dramas about, is that one or not? Is that the good one? Is that a bad one? What should we do with this one? Who is the one we are? What is the one we are together? But I think the oldest and perhaps one of the most fruitful parts of the question is, how do we get from everything to something, presuming that that's how we make a one of something. In my model of the tree concept, where I distinguished the plant/commodity, humans might refer to with this term, or the living being in the living place, an expression of its lineages and histories and ancestral beings, an expression of the living place, alive here with me, perhaps transcendent, more than merely sentient, but certainly not inert or mechanical. And then the perspective of, these living beings all around us, these are the embodied expressions of the nature and character of time-space itself, or the universe. And perhaps even the universe is an expression of something we have not been able to form a reasonable concept around. And that's not too surprising that we don't have a reasonable concept about what the universe might be an expression of. The word tree The human concept for tree is not a tree. And the word is a one, and the tree is a one. But the word exists in a mind's representational overlays. The tree is. Infinitely, it is. Very different ones. Often, those I know will think of people. They will say something about people. And they might say those ones to indicate a subset of people. Those ones who are mean, for example, or those ones who are kind. And these, of course, presume that there are ones who are always mean or always kind, and they're, out there in the world. It's a pointer. It points at something, an image, an idea, an evaluation we formed in consciousness. But that idea and those words are not people. People are all kinds of unique things moment to moment, and they transform, depending on context and relation, history, need, opportunity, threat, perception. So when I hear people say, as I just did, when I hear those known to me actually say something like, oh, people are mean, or people are dumb, or people are bad in some particular way, I become concerned. It seems a misuse of one. Someone I care deeply about the other night was very concerned that everyone was interested in destroying him. All of the ones. And I asked him to pause and think carefully about this. Do you really mean everyone? Yes, everyone. Well, are you sure? There's like little babies and old ladies in India and stuff who... And he said, oh, I see. Oh, I see. It's not everyone. That gentle soul has been injured by the habits of language that seem so authoritative that they should supervene over minds. That language should tell minds what to be and do, and so too beings. And what is good and bad, and much and little, and hot and cold, and so on. And this is one of the dangers of being formally representational cognitives in the way that we humans are. Other animals certainly have familiar assets that they've developed very differently for different purposes, and none, there does not seem to be on Earth another animal like ours that's in the same developmental problem our species is in. And since we're so prolific and momentous around here, in terms of animals, we're a threat to all the others. The threats we suffer, they must share. Sometimes I think that humans are really a strange experiment, a strange and audacious experiment, an experiment that might have been begun under the most urgent of imperatives. But I also think we're an expression of something primordial. And that we're very, very different from our tools. We're easily enchanted by our tools, including the tool of language, perhaps most foundationally this tool, but also the tool of numerism. These gifts are magical in the sense that they're exceptionally powerful in a very peculiar way that can change from benevolence to catastrophe more easily than we might imagine, more often than we might imagine, if we're not trained to treat them with care and awareness about the specific dangers and opportunities. That emerge from our circumstances and the time we live in. We imagine that humans, when we say humans, we're saying something about one thing, but we're not. We're saying something about everything. We're taking the scope of everything and looking at it through the lens of a class we imagine in our thought, stretching out perhaps over time. I mean, if I just say the word humans, do I mean the ones living now? Do I mean just the ones alive right this instant? What's the temporal scope? It's not clear. This is a problem in our language. The temporal scope of identity is made permanent and overarching. It's over-authorized. Surely we know that the tree was once a seed or even a flower or some pollen. And we know that it will be a tree and it will engage in infinite relationships as a tree, and then it will dissolve. More trees will be there, but not that tree. Not this one. But the humans are such a mysterious animal to me. How do you get an animal as astonishingly beautiful and confusable as the kinds of animals we are? And when we say human, I think we suppose that humans have always been humans. And as far as the class theoretic stuff goes, or the set theoretic stuff goes, that's not entirely unreasonable. But in terms of thinking deeply or meaningfully about it, no, humans have been and are different all over the place for all their similarities. It'd be funny to see something, to meet another intelligence that used categories for entirely different purposes than we do. We could learn a lot from this. And I don't know if the dolphins and whales and primates and birds and insects have, categories the way we do. But I think they have something similar. Right? It's probably just not as formal, and it's not linguistic in the ways, or at least it's, if anything, it's proto or meta-linguistic. Something like that. We often think in generalizations, but nearly all of our actual experiences with very specific places, moments, beings, situations. And so our language and our thinking often become desynchronized. Um, our attention and concern and awareness can be too easily led by concepts. And particularly, I think, as human beings, as modern human beings, we're vulnerable to narratives, which are something a bit like a story description. Um, although consciousness has probably been developing in myriads of human lives forever, essentially, since there were organisms that led to there being humans and so on and so forth. The particular character and inclinations of modern consciousness are surprisingly new. And it's not just that they're all new. See, again, here's the problem with language. Some of them are brand new, right, in terms of developmental time. Some of them are really, really new. They're like a year old. Of course, 1 year in human time is a lot of time since there are 7.8 billion humans. So if they're 1 year old, they're uniquely 1 year old in 7.8 billion ways. How old is that? See the problem with temporal scope? If 7.8 billion humans experience a minute, how much time is that? And are the humans really distinct in the way that our language imagines? Because we're emergently woven into the life of time-space and of the world and of all the living beings. We have these sort of very difficult, we have these properties that are extremely difficult and confusing to try to capture in the language that we're used to using in the ways we're used to using it. And we can learn about these things so that it's possible to speak intelligently and to understand that identity has a temporal scope. But we can also understand that identity, which is related to what we mean by one what, one where, one how, one who, one why, one reason. If we include temporal scope in identity, if we include different versions of relational scope, so that we understand that identity isn't merely a property possessed. It's not like things and beings are containers, the way we might be inclined to think about them or speak about them in English. Right? We think my mind is inside me. My soul is inside me. I'm a container for my mind and my soul and my anatomy. And while that perspective isn't entirely useless or unreasonable, it's insufficiently sophisticated to help us much if we want to think about identity or one intelligently. For accounting purposes, ones are perfectly distinguished things. Dollars, for example. A dollar is a really strange thing because it's a mostly valueless thing, that because we all imagine and agree it is valuable, many diverse repercussions and institutions and habits and behaviors and activities and concerns emerge from that decision. And you can see in the idea of $1 the motivation to perfectly distinguish one actual thing, complete unto itself, de-infinitized, manipulable, exchangeable, a commodity. a token. One of the things the token can get rid of, though it can also catalyze this, is relationships. We don't have to have the relationship if we can pay the money. Or rather, the nature of the relationship will become transactional. Less like two beings in agreement, more like two beings with a representation of agreement that we call dollars. Cleans up the mess of the infinity of variables involved in actual agreements and relationships rather nicely. Unfortunately, also produces versions of humanity that are self-terminating, egregiously disoriented, and so on. Self and other terminating. But there are some very profound instances of union, one, identity, nearby. Though it's not the beginning or the end of the story, Earth is one world. And all the beings here are one family. And these are things we can say in language to point at blatantly obvious perspectives that we could have if we were lifted out of our local awareness into, for example, outer space, where the astronauts reported seeing the planet and just being completely overwhelmed and realizing, oh my God, it's a tiny little island in a vast and endless ocean. It's just one island. And really there's just one, you could think this way anyway, there's one animal here that expresses itself in billions of different ways. There's one being here that expresses itself in billions of different ways. But that's much more theoretical. The sun is very obviously one nearby, really pretty benevolent star. And the moon is one. Though, of course, with the bright side and the dark side, we see suddenly the emergence of two, and with day and night, we see the emergence of two. There is the one when the sun is here, and there is the one when the sun is gone, hiding. You know, one of the perhaps fascinating things to explore about one is, am I the same one I was? I have the same name. I have a body that seems continuous in time-space, even though it's transforming constantly. It's almost like I'm something that rides the transformations of my body through time-space. But yeah, the temporal scope of identity applies to us as well. If I think, for example, oh, I remember the day I did something really beautiful. I rescued that animal, or I helped someone who was in trouble and needed a friend. Which me was there? I'm having a relationship with memory, which is a lot like a relationship with dreaming. I imagine that that was the same person that I am today. I have the same name and such. My social security number hasn't changed. But am I that same one And someone in a conversation the other night about a related topic said something that really knocked me out of my chair. They said that humans are the only animal that walks through the world feeling culpable. Or, I'm paraphrasing it slightly. The actual statement was simpler. But it might have been, why are we an animal that walks through the world feeling culpable? And of course, to feel culpable requires certain extensions to the scope of identity over time. We must imagine that I am the same person now in all the ways that matter that I was then. If I am to take credit or to blame myself or be punished or, whatever. To feel embarrassed or ashamed. And so there's this really strange thing about the relationship between time and one. I don't know what the relationship is between my memory of having done something and my identity when I'm recalling that. And this leads off, there's a branch here that would be fun to follow, but is too fraught with mystery. And the branch has to do with, what's all this memory stuff going on? What is memory? And you can see that ideas and language are ways of structuring memory so that it holds a form over time. And this particular feature is astonishing and creates the possibility of something resembling time travel in consciousness or in awareness, in thought, in concern. And one particularly precocious man said that the salient feature of our humanity, he's speaking in ways that defy his own admonitions against doing this, but is that we are time binders. We bind ideas, language, habits, theories, knowledge, and transmit it generation to generation, and somewhat transform it, but also keep it stable. And he was very concerned about the dangers of such a situation, as am I. And I'm not sure I agree with him about the salient feature, but it's certainly an important aspect and was useful. His ideas were very useful. I'm talking about Alfred Korzybski, the author of Science and Sanity. One of the strangest books I've ever come across, and a truly brilliant and important book. But one that I doubt would be accessible to wide audiences. In any case, part of why, one way to understand something about why there's an animal that feels culpable is, or descends from our peculiar relationship with thought, language, evaluation, and memory. These things. But of course, without memory, all of this discussion disappears. Right? And so you can see that language and knowledge are like taking the substance of memory and forming it into structured frameworks with internal coherence and that last. And these frameworks survive in human minds and lives, and they reproduce in human minds and lives, and are transformed and stabilized in human minds and lives. And perhaps other minds are participating with ours, minds of forms we've been too timid to imagine. I suspect something like this is going on, but it's difficult to talk about it. And you can see the problem here, right? Because if other minds are participating in ours, then my mind is not one. It might not even be mine. It could be something I'm doing with myriad other beings, right? That I have a particular idea about. I have an explanation of what my mind is, which is a pretty strange thing to have, by the way. Without memory, it's very difficult to have language or concern or even computation. Even in our machines, we have the sort of processors that transform essential data, but we have memory within which the transformations take place and within which we build structured frameworks to manipulate the data for purposes we're interested in. So it's, in a way, it simulates a very narrow aspect, an abstract, sort of an abstraction of a narrow array of functions minds may perform. Now it is the evening chorus of the birds here. The dawn and evening choruses of the birds are one of the most amazing and beautiful things I've ever experienced in my life as a human being. Language and knowledge, I'll say again, are like magic. We could imagine a story where something cast a spell on our people, and our peculiar relationships with language and knowledge are the shadow aspect of that spell we're under. But when I call them magical, I just mean they are non-ordinary. There are dangers associated with them we should look very carefully into. And there are opportunities associated with them that we could make wise and intelligent use of. Some ones might argue, all of this is very philosophical. The ordinary person doesn't need this. Now, I'm imagining people who would make this argument. I'm not saying there are actually people that I know that will. And this is an example of our capacity to imagine critics. A very strange feature of our uniquely human need for to be positively observed and our desire not to be negatively observed. And these are deeply felt and embodied aspects of being human. We would like to be seen when and how we would like to be seen. We would not like to be seen where and when we do not wish to be seen. And language is a presentation. It's a display phenomenon where we're signaling to others, nearby usually, sometimes far away, for purposes we become concerned with, interested in, or desire to avoid. To be without the thinking mind for a moment is an astonishing thing. Any experience of this will transform our thought if we're available to such transformation. And it's kind of fascinating that for most of us, when we lay down to go to sleep, or when we finally fall asleep, the thinking mind fades off, trails away, and the resources that I think are ordinarily shunted into the very expensive process of having thoughts and then reacting to those in one's body, and then having more thoughts and then reacting to those. That process doesn't entirely disappear, but it certainly transforms in astonishing and beautiful ways when we dream. But who is dreaming? Is that a different one from me? Is there two? Is there more than two? What is one? Where is the one of me? Where is the one I am? The simple answer is my body. In my mind, there can be many, many minds. They change and transform in circumstances, concern, context. But my body is the familiar, ongoing vessel of my being, for now. As the sun is setting and I'm listening to the birds and a few other animals singing, I want to let go of my intellect and all of its sophistication and just be alive for a moment in the astonishing beauty and ancient agreements of the universe and this living world that I adore so deeply. May your own dreaming and wonder, questions and learning be deep and rich and beautiful. I look forward to our next adventure. Thank you.